Well, we're back here with Don Graves. I'm Tom from the History Symposium. Don is a well-known Canadian military historian, published his first work on a War of 1812 subject in the late 1970s. Since that time, he's brought out 5 books on 1812 topics, as well as 3 volumes of memoirs, and edited a new edition of a classic history of the war. Don has also produced 11 books or monographs on other topics of Canadian military history, ranging from 1690 to 1945. So, this is part of a series of episodes and conversations that we're recording and hosting here on our YouTube channel. Make sure you check out the entire dedicated playlist with Don. So, Don, today we're going to talk about the British Army.
Yeah, well, I thought what I'd do is give some background of the Army of the Napoleonic Wars, and then in another topic we can come down to the British Army in Canada. Um, so let's start. Let's start with the American Revolutionary War. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris brought an end to the Revolutionary War. The British Army left the 13 colonies; those that were left. Um, Went back to Britain. They were defeated. But what a lot of Americans don't realize is that the American Revolutionary War was greater than the war in North America, because as soon as the Bourbon monarchies joined in, France and Spain, on America, on the 13 colonies side, it became a global effort. And much of the British Army during the war was kept there and kept involved in European operations. But anyway, in 1783, the Army came home. Much of it was disbanded. It expanded during the war. It was now reduced. And it would be said that the 1780s were the nadir of the Army. Things were bad. The recruiting was low. There was financial cutbacks. The Prime Minister, William Pitt the Younger, did not believe in the large standing army. The army was never popular with the average citizen, because they were also used as a police force, and this did not uh, make them endearing to citizens, because they were used for riot control, customs regulations, things like this. Also, they were often billeted on the civilians, which they did not like. So all said and done, it was a bad time that decade. Now the purchase system got out of control. The purchase system, a lot of people understand the purchase system. Just a minute, I've lost.
I still hear and see you fine.
Okay, fine. Well, I'll just go on without my screen. The, the purchase system was not so much a way of buying your way through the army. It started in the 1690s, when William and Mary came to the throne, and they raised an army. They wanted officers who were loyal, and it was felt that if you had a stake, i.e., a financial stake in the army, you would be more loyal to the crown. And so you purchased your rank, and really you put a deposit of money on a rank. And you could purchase your way up to captain, major, lieutenant colonel, but no farther. And it had its ups and downs, and it was certainly subject to abuse. But it really, really hit the bottom in the 1780s, when 12-year-old boys were commanding regiments. At one point, a teenage girl was commanding a cavalry squadron, things like this. Too much money passing hands under the table. So in February 1793, the French Republic declared war on Britain. Britain didn't declare war on France, it's the other way around. The army went to war. It was under strength, it was ill trained, ill led. There was no commander in chief, and the government wanted to do a repetition of their successful strategy in the 7 Years' War, which was to not get involved in the European mainland campaign, but to work on the periphery. And their idea was to capture the French possessions in the West Indies. So a large part of the army campaigned in the West Indies from 1793 to 1795, and most of it died there from yellow fever. Estimates range between 45,000 and 90,000 troops died. That's a considerable number when the army did not consist of more than 150, 175,000. So they had to recoup those losses, more recruiting. And there's a couple of bad campaigns in Holland, which the army did not particularly distinguish itself. It was a time where one general said, I don't know what they do to the enemy, but by God, they frighten me. When referring to his own troops. The good thing was in 1795, the Duke of York, the second son of George III, of blessed memory, was appointed commander-in-chief of the army. And with York had royal authority, and he could make changes and improvements, and nobody dared go up against him. He cleaned up the purchase system. Officers had to be a certain age. They had to serve a certain time in rank, and to buy the next step. I should mention that when a vacancy occurred within a regiment, the vacancy was offered to the next senior officer within the regiment, and only if there were no takers in a regiment did it go outside the regiment. The other thing was that casualties and vacancies, if you want to call them that, which occurred through sickness or combat on campaign, were filled by the Duke of York himself. He made the choice. So often he would choose a regimental officer to replace. He tried to keep the officers within the regiment, but occasionally he'd give a vacancy, say, for captaincy to a lieutenant who had done something notable, and he would reward him for it. Now, 1795. The other thing, and this is very important, York. There had been a doctrinal argument within the army from the end of the Revolutionary War between two schools, the so-called German school and the so-called American school. The American school consisted of veterans of the Revolutionary War. John Graves Simcoe is one that comes to mind, who had seen service in North America. They tended to put less emphasis on tight formations that were useful to resist cavalry, and they were very keen on skirmishers, light infantry. In other words, the lessons they'd learned during the Revolutionary War. The German school were traditionalists. They believed in tight, compact formations that you were able to deploy into a formation to resist cavalry, because Europe was more open country, and there was more cavalry in these operations. So the proponents of both schools argued and fought against each other. But finally, York made a decision, and he didn't bring out, but he put his imprimatur or approval on the 1792 regulations, which were based on a series of exercises and drills and maneuvers held by the Irish garrison in Dublin. And this 1792 regulations then became the manual for the whole army. The only thing about it was the work of a officer of the German school, and it didn't mention light infantry. I think there was 5 pages given to it. So a supplemental manual was brought out, written by de Rottenberg, who later served in the War of 1812, about light infantry and skirmish warfare. So these two manuals then were more or less the Bibles that took the army through to the remainder of the Napoleonic Wars. Now to come back and after all these sort of desperate campaigns in West Indies and Holland, an expedition was sent to recover Egypt from the French. Napoleon had conquered Egypt and then more or less left his army there and buggered off back to France. And a British expedition was sent out under General Ralph Abercrombie. Abercrombie was fortunate in that he was able to actually prepare his troops for battle. He got about 5 to 6 weeks in Turkey, in which he was able to train and drill and get his units working together. This was the first time that a British army had been sent overseas since the beginning of the war, which was actually well trained. It landed in Alexandria. It fought 2 major battles. It oversaw the surrender of the French army in Egypt. And a lot of the young officers who served in the Egyptian campaign, notably Sir John Harvey and Thomas Pearson, my good old hero, veterans of the Egyptian campaign. Well, following that, then the army was brought back. Most of the army was brought back to England, and it had like 3-4 years to recoup, recover, and recruit. And it hadn't had this. It had been sent around helter-skelter for more than a decade. So it was in good shape. And also it fought a battle against the French at Maida in Italy, where it used its tactic against the French tactic. We'll discuss that at length at a later time, I'm sure. But the British tactic of the line versus the French tactic of the column, the British tactic, providing you had well-trained soldiers, was superior. We then come to 1808 and the involvement of the army in Spain. And for the next 6 years, the major British war effort, was to assist the Spanish and the Portuguese to fight off the French. And this is where the Duke of Wellington came to prominence. And this is where a lot of officers got a lot of good experience. Again, Tom Pearson's one, and Joseph Morrison, who won the Battle of Kruisers Farm. They were experienced officers who saw combat in Spain. So that brings the army up to 1812. But I want to talk a bit about the organization of the army. Now, in most armies in the world, the American and German, French, a regiment is an organized military unit consisting of 2 or more battalions. Not so in the British or Commonwealth armies, including the Canadian Army. A regiment is part of a unit's title, but the operative unit is a battalion, and the operative equivalent to an American regiment is a British brigade. And you know, a Canadian or British regiment might have 2-3 battalions, but they never necessarily fought together. I mean, right now in the Canadian Army, I think the Royal Canadian Regiment has 2 battalions near Petawawa, at Petawawa, near Ottawa, and a battalion in Gagetown, about 600 miles away. That battalion in Gagetown's brigade, and will not necessarily fight with its other 2 battalions. And this is the way it was in the British Army. The British Army consisted of 104 regiments, each having 1 battalion, and some, not all, having 2 or more battalions. I think the 60th Foot
They have seven? No,
Yes, it's seven battalions.
and I
And I
think
think
I think the Royal Scots had five. Yeah, so it was sort of all over the place, right?
it's all over the place. It's all
Yeah.
over the place. Um, the When referring to battalions, when there's more than one battalion of a regiment in the same territory, you say like first to the first footer would be one slant first foot. If there's no other battalions in that area, you simply refer to them as first foot. So this then I want to talk a bit about the battalion itself, uh, the organization of the battalion. There was uh, a colonel of the regiment, um, a colonel of the Royal Scots, for instance, had five battalions. But there was a colonel. He did. It was not a command position. It was actually it was a reward given to senior officers who had accomplished great deeds or seen good service. The colonel didn't have anything to do with the day-to-day activity of his regiment, but he had a lot to say about its traditions, its uniforms, um, various other things, and promotion. But really, the operative officer, was the lieutenant colonel who commanded a battalion. So each British battalion, now not all of them, but this is the general organization. Each battalion consisted of a lieutenant colonel who had a small staff, which consisted of an adjutant, a quartermaster, a paymaster, and a surgeon. He had three majors. One was the second in command, and the other two majors, when the battalion was in line, it would have 10 companies. One major would command the left five, and the other major would command the right five. These were known as wings. Now, below that, you had 10 companies, each commanded by a captain with the first lieutenant and the second lieutenant, and this title was beginning to change. The second lieutenant in some regiments was called an ensign. Of these 10 companies, 8 were known as line companies or center companies. And when the regiment was in line, they were the middle 8. There are 2 companies on either flank, which were known as the flank companies. These were the elite companies. The first was a grenadier company, supposedly consisting of the largest and most veteran and experienced soldiers in the battalion. They were on the right of the battalion when it was in line, and on the other flank, on the left flank, was the light infantry company, uh, which provided the battalion with skirmishers, advance guards, rear guards, flank guards. It supposedly consisted of the most intelligent and active men in the regiment. So these companies were often taken away from their battalions and grouped together. At the Battle of Chippewa, the 3 battalions of the 1st, the 8th, and the 100th, their light companies were taken away from them and put under Pearson on the right flank of the British Army. And this was quite common. Same with the Grenadiers.
Or
Now,
if I can add, like 1814, the remnants of the 41st, essentially they just used the flank companies, and then just from the rest, they constantly topped up the flank companies, like trying to keep them to strength while the line
yeah,
companies were undeveloped, unskilled, and under strength, right? So,
yeah, yeah, 104th was the same. It more or less gave up the ghost in the Niagara in 1813. And in 1814, where you see the 104th, it's the flank companies uh, they're really the regiment. The line companies are back in Kingston. Um, what was I going to say? Okay, now talk a bit about the regimental staff because these are important guys. The adjutant and the quartermaster were often commissioned from the ranks. These are former sergeants, senior NCOs with a lot of experience. The adjutant's major job was to drill the battalion for the lieutenant colonel. He was in charge of training and drilling, but gradually his appointment evolved into something else, and he became something of an executive officer, transmitting orders from the battalion commander to the company commanders. And gradually, he became the adjutant today in an infantry battalion is sort of the CO's executive, in that he transmits orders and sees that they're carried out. And post of adjutant is often given to an officer, a captain, who's marked for future promotion, and it's a stepping stone to higher command. And usually today, a good adjutant and a good company commander are often at loggerheads, but I won't go down there. The second staff member was the quartermaster. Now, he was in charge of getting everything the battalion needed in the way of food from the commissary. He would get the food from the commissariat, distribute it. He would arrange for billets when a battalion was in a built-up a village or town, where he would choose a bivouac site when they camped. He was also responsible, and this is often overlooked, he was responsible for intelligence. So he was involved with scouting. And again, this function of the quartermaster is often overlooked. Then we have the paymaster. I should add, the quartermaster again was often promoted, commissioned from the ranks. Then we have the paymaster. Well, his job is fairly straightforward. The British Army was mustered and paid on the 25th of every month. Prior to 1809, it was mustered and paid on the 1st of every month. But in 1809, they changed it to the 25th. And I have a hunch that someone got soft and decided the 25th, the troops should be paid on Christmas Day so they could have a little bit of a jollity. And this is why I think they chose the 25th. Anyway, his big time was the 25th of the month, and young officers who were almost always desperately broke and underpaid lived from the 25th to the 25th. Indeed. And, when I was in the militia, more years than I like to think, we were still paid the traditional way. The paymaster sat at a desk, they put it outside, and he had cash, and you marched up alphabetical order, not by rank, alphabetical order. You put your berets, in our case, and he looked up at the book and said, Graves, Gunner, $3.76. And he just peeled it off. Now, mind you, standing beside him were two sergeants with submachine guns. Nobody's going to mess with the paymaster. There's a famous story about there was an RSM in the Canadian Army in the 50s and 60s named Scotty Lawson of the Black Watch when it was a regular regiment, and he used to delight in going on the pay parade and rearranging the soldiers. Like he would say, Phipps, what the hell are you doing in the P's? Get up in the F's where you belong. And Phipps would go, yes, Sergeant Major. He would go ahead and get paid earlier, that kind of thing.
So can I ask now, the paymaster, that was a civilian, like that wasn't a commissioned officer, right?
He was semi. Okay, he was semi, but he had a commission. Yeah, but
Okay.
it wasn't a commission. How you really get into nuances here. Oh, I know what it was. He didn't carry a sword. The adjutant and the quartermaster had swords. He did not carry a sword. So he was an officer, yet not an officer. Like the surgeon, who I'm going to talk about next, also a member of the staff. The surgeon, of course, was in charge of the health of the battalion. There was a sick call every day, and of course, when they're in combat, he's busy looking after the casualties. There were supposed to be two assistant surgeons, but uh, my reading is there was usually only one. They were always short an assistant surgeon. And final member of the staff, um, and again, it wasn't every battalion who had it. It was really a matter, I think, up to the battalion commander, was a chaplain or padre. And I don't know much about them. They had their I don't think there were that many in Canada with the units because they're not measured that often.
I remember Ray Hobbs doing a paper. He looked at that, and it seemed like the chaplains were assigned from the local community, like in
Yeah,
Amherstburg, in Newark or Niagara, and stuff like that.
yeah. Well, when the wounded were lying in a hospital at York, uh, John Strawn, the Archbishop of Upper Canada, used to come down and preach to them. They're lying there in their straw, you know, and these long, long, wordy sermons from the Church of England and George Ferguson, Private Ferguson, who was a Methodist minister, a lay preacher, hated these sermons. Of course, they were completely. It was Anglican theology versus Methodist theology, and he just hated to have to lay there and listen to this nonsense, as he called it. But anyway, to come back to the battalion, um, the other thing we have to talk about the color guard or the guard of the color. Each battalion had two colors, flags, if you will, but they're not really flags because they're not hoisted, so they're standards. These are big, big standards, about 6 foot on the hoist and 6 foot in the fly.
Yeah.
There was two. Uh, the King's color was the Union Jack with the Royal Crest and the uh, number of the regiment. And then there was the regimental color, which was in the color of the regiment's facings, like the 49th was green, so they had a green regimental color. And on it was the regimental badge. Any special things like the White Horse of Hanover, if the regiment had fought in a Battle of Minden, or a Sphinx, if the regiment had fought in Egypt, and also the battle honors of the regiment. Um, there weren't that many accumulated in 1812, but in modern days, they have to grade the battle honors, those that are inscribed and those that are not inscribed, because the flag simply won't carry more than about 25 battle honors.
Yeah. Yeah.
In the standard bearers were the two most junior lieutenants in a regiment, and you know why they because not really knowing much and probably being more trouble than they're worth. It
I
was a
was going to
very
say the most expendable.
well, the old army joke before the introduction of GPS, the old joke was the most dangerous thing in the world is a new second lieutenant with a map. uh, yeah. So anyway, these two young lads, and they were often young, and a guard of four color sergeants, uh, four NCOs to protect them. And if they fell, one of the NCOs would take the standard. And I think it was a Waterloo, Sergeant Wheeler's memoirs. He was a member of the color guard, but the two standard bearers were shot or wounded, and the four color guard were shot or wounded, and they started to call sergeants up from the line companies because they had to be sergeants, and he was called to do color duty, and he wasn't happy about it at all because the colors were good aiming marks, and they always worked very closely in when the battalion was in battle. They were very close to the commanding officer, and they served not only as um, a means by which the battalion could align its ranks, but they also served as a means by which messengers could find the commanding officer. They'd head for the colors. Um, I think that pretty well covers what I wanted to say about the battalion. But you have to understand the battalion to really understand the British Army, which it might be said is a loose confederation of tribal units called regiments, but actually battalions, because some battalions um, uh, didn't like each other. I mean, in the same regiment, and you really had trouble when you started to combine regiments like the 43rd and 52nd Light Infantry, famous regiments on the peninsula. They were amalgamated later in the 19th century, and there was an officer of the 52nd every morning would strap his razor on a leather belt, and he'd get to 43 and he'd spit. He'd go on to 52, this sort of thing.
If, if I can add, the organization of battalion, you referenced 10 companies. Ideally, the company would be at full strength about 100 men, right? And so a battalion would be roughly 1,000. But then I think wartime strength, you start talking about how they keep these going, and then you're probably talking more company strength, 55, 60, 70 in that range, because of
Well, inspection returns I've looked at, 55 to 60 would be a good number, because don't forget the units in Canada, you had trouble getting replacement. The regular British Army was not allowed to recruit in Canada. Okay, only defensible regiments, which we'll talk about down the line, could recruit in Canada because they did not want colonists getting into the army. They were supposed to be colonizing, um, cutting down forests and farming and doing whatever. So they weren't allowed to recruit in Canada. So to get recruits, you had to go to Britain and recruit them the traditional way. Um, and to replace combat casualties, it took a year. I mean, the sailing season was mid to late April to mid to late September. So you had to, don't forget that as soon as the ice froze in the St. Lawrence during the war, you couldn't get messages back to Britain. So often it would be when the sailing season started in April, and it would take about 4 or 5 weeks to get a message to get replacements for the 41st to the 49th, 4 or 5 weeks to get back to the Horse Guards or the headquarters of the British Army, and then it would take like another 5 or 6 weeks to get the replacements all in place and march to a port. And we're now talking 2.5 months, and it would probably take another 3 weeks for them to get to Quebec. So in essence, it took a year just about to get replacements. So this is why there was a constant, the strengths dropped off from sickness, desertion. There was a lot of desertion. There's 1,500 British regulars deserted during the war. That's in the inspection reports. And there were reasons for that. One was discipline. The discipline in the British Army was ferocious, no doubt about it. The primary punishment was flogging. Interestingly enough, in the French Army, it was execution, and I'm not sure which I prefer. And flogging wasn't, as it's often portrayed, like captain or the commanding officer would say, "Oh, I'll give him 50 lashes, he'll feel better next time or do better." It was regulated. A surgeon had to be present, and he could stop the procedure at any time if he felt that the soldier would die or would be crippled. You had to have the officers attend. You had the regiment had to attend. They usually form a hollow square. The man was flogged with a cat o' nine tails. I could tell you a tale about the cat o' nine tails. When I worked with René Chartrand of Parks Canada. Oh, gee, getting on for half a century ago now. They had several cat o' nine tails made up for historic sites. They found an old sailor who knew how to make them out of rope and the nine tails and the knot. And he was with one of his fellow curators, and he said, "Let's see just what this thing will do." And they took one and they hit, a standard filing cabinet. How metal,
Yeah.
thickness of metal. There were 9 dents in that filing cabinet. And you go, oh, yeah. John Lee Couture, his first flogging, he was standing near what they call they made a tripod of halberds, and
Yes.
man was lashed to it. Well, he was standing close to tripod, and when the flogger, who was usually a drummer, and drummers weren't always boys, brought the cat o' nine tails back, it spread blood all over Lee Couture's face, and he fainted dead away, which was a source of much amusement to his fellow officers. But the men of his company noted that, and they thought, he's affected. And he never, all the time he was in the army, he tried not to punish his men. He tried to award good behavior. That was his theory. And it worked because his men really, really appreciated, admired him, and they would follow him anywhere. This is a 19-year-old boy. So there you have the prime punishment. Now, twice a year, a battalion was inspected by a senior officer, and he looked into all kinds of things: their drill, their dress, their deportment, the state of the company books, the finances. One thing was they had to keep a punishment a roll. And there's a couple of these that survived I've seen that would list, Private John Smith, insolent officer, 25 lashes, Corporal J. Smith, drunk on duty, 50 lashes. Those were the lashes awarded, but then there's another column, the actual lashes given. And what they would do, they would, most battalion commanders would award 100 lashes, but they would remit 50 or more. So in many cases, it was like, especially with drunkenness, which was just a besetting sin in the British Army. When a guy had sobered up, was brought before the battalion commander and realized what he'd done, he'd give him a high number of lashes, but he would remit them. So there was a trade-off here. Now, what did I want to talk about next? So we got through discipline. There were about, in 1812, June of, there were just nearly about 9,000 British regulars in Canada, about the same number as were in the American Army, regular army at that time, which if you're going to invade Canada, you want to have at least twice as many troops as the defenders, and that's not counting the militia or the indigenous warriors, which backed them up. I should maybe talk about defensible regiments, because this is a topic that often gets confused. Defensible regiments were British regular regiments, but they were only liable for service in a certain area, and in our case was British North America. Well, whereas regiments in the line were enlisted for universal service, they could be sent anywhere in the world. There were 6 of these regiments: Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick. Wait a minute, 5, sorry. Canadian Fencibles in Lower Canada, and the Glengarry Light Infantry Fencibles in Upper Canada. These were the same as officered by regular officers enlisted for long periods, trained, drilled, armed, and equipped as British regulars. The Glengarrys were special because they were raised as light infantry and modeled really after the 95th or the 60th. They were given green uniforms. And very interesting stories, but there's no difference between them and British regulars except the fact that they didn't have to serve outside British North America, which, by the way, at this time included Bermuda, but did not include Newfoundland. And
So,
oh,
but the other distinction with Fencibles, though, is they were raised in Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Lower Canada, Upper Canada, right? Rather than troops from Britain being sent to Canada to populate them.
I'm sorry, I should have mentioned that. They were recruited in
Yeah.
Canada, but the fact that they were Nova Scotia or New Brunswick, any warm body they could get, they would take. In fact, the Canadian Fencibles had a large number of Americans in their ranks who had uh, who had moved into Lower Canada for business reasons and found themselves sort of adrift, broke, homeless, and enlisted in the Canadian Fencibles. I never did have much respect for the Canadian Fencibles, but those in the reenactment group will probably kill me for saying that.
I was just thinking about those guys.
Say what?
I was just thinking about those guys. I know a number of them quite well. So,
I do too. I mean, I, I, anyway, one other unit um, that I want to mention is the 10th Royal Veteran Battalion, which was played a fairly active part in the first months of the war, and then after that, more or less disappeared. The Royal Veterans Battalions were old veteran soldiers who weren't really up to it anymore and were used as garrison troops. And one of these veterans battalions was in Canada, the 10th, and one of their own officers said these so many years drinking, they're just a dissipated a lot of scoundrels. And they fought in a few battles. Uh, um, they were involved in the capture of Mackinac. They were involved in the capture of Detroit. And thereafter, they were moved back to Kingston and then Montreal as garrison. So these these are men at the end of their service life. When you enlisted in the British Army, you enlisted for a period after 1810 anyway, for a period of 7 years. And then at the end of those 7 years, you could enlist for a farther seven. And then at the end of the 14, a farther seven. And when you did the full 21 years with the colors, you got a pension. So there was a an incentive there to keep re-upping. And some men did. Some men did. Is there anything else we can discuss? We're going to do arms and ordnance at a later time. And I think we're going to do camp life and social life at a later time.
yeah.
But
How about a basic question? Why were the majority of the British uniforms red? Why'd they choose that color?
that's a good question because the color of the British royalty is blue. And as you know, a royal regiment would have the red coats faced blue, blue collars and cuffs.
Yeah.
Now, I'm just I'm trying to think where that goes back. Think to the English Civil War, 1640s. Um, no, I can't answer that question.
Well, I'll take my stab at it.
Okay,
So European battlefields, it's not like you have camouflage, right? You're bringing large bodies of troop in contact with each other, and they're going to have distinctive colored uniforms, so you can tell one side apart from the other. And I always understood the British, it was a pretty natural military motivation. The red matter dye that they used for the regulars coats was the cheapest one available. blue or some of the other colors were far more expensive. So we have a large army. Let's do this as cheaply as possible. So
Well, that's probably probably the reason. I can't say. I do know, as you know, officers and sergeants and drummers had scarlet cloth, was a better dye than the red coat of the privates and corporals, which was sort of a brick red color, and I think very shortly faded to a
I
pinky.
have my original private's coat. Yes, after 20 years, it's sort of pink salmon. I don't know what you call it, but yes, it's and I can attest to the officers' wool being much better quality, super
Yeah,
fine. I guess they call it, and a different ink. I think it
yeah,
was from a shellfish or something like that, cochineal
Neil, yes,
yeah.
yeah. So, but I don't know why, but your explanation seems reasonable. I know that the Royal Artillery, with being a Royal Regiment, were in blue, and also they like blue because they were always had powder marks on their uniforms, and it didn't show up as much on the blue uniforms, and so they
But
like their blue.
yeah, and it's maybe worth mentioning with the uniforms, and maybe we can get into that more detail. The uniform distinctions were quite practical. You mentioned facing colors, like the Royal Regiments, with that royal blue. So the facings are the collar and cuffs on a uniform that would influence the regimental colors. But like 41st were red, the 49th were green, 89th were black. Like you had, I find at a reenactment between the facing colors and then the lace pattern on the coat, like I know what soldier belongs to what regiment, right? And it becomes very obvious if they're out of position or out of place. So yeah.
Yeah. Well, the trained eye, and then there's the lace, the 10 rows of lace down the front of their coatee, uh, how it ended, whether it was a bastion or square or pointed. There's
Yeah.
all these little things you have to know. I often, when I'm around reenactors, I'm just doofing along there, your average civilian, and I'll see one and I'll say, "Hey, how's the 89th today?" Or your lace is out is not right. But I don't do that too much.
All right. Well, why don't we finish this here today, and then our next episode we'll delve more deeply into the British Army, and then especially as it occurred in Canada through the course of the War of 1812. So this seems like a natural place to break off for today.
Okay. Well, we got lots to talk about.
As long as you're
I'll
willing to keep talking, I'm willing to keep recording. So we'll keep this going. So yeah.
probably talk for ad infinitum about the War of 18.
Well, I was thinking you could probably piece all this together and it could be a university course on the War of 1812 by the
There you
time we're
go.
finished.
There
Eh?
you go. There you
All right.
go.
All right. Thank you, Don. Much appreciated.
Okay. Bye, Tom.